Hello, good morning to everyone. We are arrived at the final, at the last keynote seminar of the spring series of the Spotlight Seminars in AI, organized by the Italian Association for Artificial Intelligence. And it's a really great pleasure for us to have Nicolò Cesabianchi here today. And of course, we are also with the committee organizing this event with Chiara Ghedini and Giuseppe De Giacomo, which I thank very much. And so I leave the floor to Chiara for presenting Nicolò.
Thank you, Gianluigi. It's a great pleasure to introduce Nicolò Cesabianchi. Nicolò is Professor of Computer Science at the University of Milan and also holds a joint appointment at the Polytechnic University of Milan. His main research interests are the design and analysis of machine learning algorithms for online learning, sequential decision-making, and graph analytics. He has co-authored important monographs and also served as president of the Association for Computational Learning and co-chaired the program committees of important machine learning conferences. Last but not least, he is the recipient of several awards, among which the Google Research Award, the Xerox Foundation Award, a Google Focused Award, and the IBM Research Award. He is a very central person in the ELLIS network, so he's an ELLIS fellow, member of the ELLIS board, and co-director of the Milan ELLIS unit. So he today will present us his research on online learning, bandits, and digital markets. And Nicolò, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for the presentation, and thanks to Hyperia for the nice invitation. I'm very glad and honored to close this series of keynote seminars. I've been working for basically my entire career in the intersection between statistical learning and online learning. But lately, in the last years, I focused more on online learning and also problem of sequential decision making with partial feedback. But in order to present what is online learning, I would like to briefly introduce the statistical learning framework, which is the reference framework for the analysis of learning algorithms. So one of the founders of the area is Vladimir Vapnik, who characterized the notion of learnability in terms of how much information we need in order to achieve a certain accuracy under statistical condition on the generation of the data. In the US, independently, Les Valiant and the Turing Award characterized the computational complexity of learning problems. So it was looking more from the computational viewpoint as opposed to Vapnik, who was focusing on the information complexity of the problem. And the main contribution of statistical learning, I mean, there are countless contributions. Among the most important is the formulation of crisp combinatorial conditions characterizes what can be learned. And the design of guidelines for practitioners in order to perform model selection and control of overfitting. And we also recall the important algorithms that have been produced by the learning theory community, such as support vector machines and boosting. Okay. One of the key concepts in statistical learning is a bias variance decomposition for a learning algorithm. And this hinges on the notion of statistical risk of a predictor with respect to a certain loss in the data distribution. This is the expected loss of a given predictor on a random example drawn from the fixed but unknown distribution that characterizes the learning problem. This allows us to define the optimal predictor, which is the base optimal predictor in statistical learning, and perform the bias variance decomposition, which provides a simple explanation of overfitting and underfitting. So in general, however, so one of the reasons why we may need more than one model to analyze the phenomenon of machine learning is the fact that data may come in different ways, and one source of data that these days is very ubiquitous are data streams. Data streams are produced by financial markets, by sensor networks, and by interactions of users with websites and platforms for e-commerce. So in this case, since data is being produced all the time, learning models can be updated as soon as new data arrive. So this implies that the traditional paradigm of statistical learning, which is the train-test paradigm, becomes not very well suited for the data streaming scenario. So actually the roots of online learning are much older than many people may think. So online learning is connected to the theory of repeated games, which is a theory pioneered by James Hannan and David Blackwell in the late 50s. And it also connected with the analysis of certain learning algorithms, like the analysis of the perceptron algorithm, which is morally a sequential analysis. And however, it was only in the late 80s that the online learning model, almost as we know it today, was formalized by Nick Littlestone and Manfred Warmuth. And in particular, in the PhD thesis of Nick Littlestone, which is the smiling guy with the straw hat in the middle of the line of pictures. And the thesis was called Mistake Bounds and Logarithmic Linear Threshold Learning Algorithms. And Volodya Vovk, the last guy in the picture, developed independently in the Soviet Union shortly before the breakup, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a similar online learning framework. And all these contributions are now reconciled and acknowledged by the research community, so that we have a sort of a unified theory that contains all these threads that come from different communities, including information theory, game theory, computer science, and statistics. So in the online learning protocol, the algorithm starts with some default model, which is typically a predictor, something function mapping data points to predictions. And then for each new data point in the stream, the current model is tested on the data point, and the algorithm is charged with the corresponding loss. And according to the specific problem we are considering, this could be square loss, classification loss, or other losses. And after being charged with this loss, the algorithm is able to compute a new model by using this new information. And crucially, the computation of this new model should rely on local information, meaning the current model and the data point that has been observed in the stream. Okay, and what is typical in online learning, and in this case we can recognize the game theoretic roots, is the fact that we do not make any assumption on the mechanism that is generating the data stream. So it could be a completely deterministic and even adversarial mechanism. So there are many applications of online learning, not only for the analysis of data streams, but also in traditional machine learning, when, for instance, we have large training sets, and therefore we cannot optimize globally some objective function on the training set, but we would rather resort to local optimization, in which case we just use a stochastic gradient descent method, which is typically based on some online learning algorithm like AdaGrad and the many variants of it. Okay, so the more formal setting of online learning that has been formalized a couple of decades ago is called online convex optimization. And this is just the formalization of the previous protocol I just showed 2 slides ago. So we are considering a model space, which is some convex closed and non-empty subset of the d-dimensional Euclidean space. And the data stream is just for notational convenience replaced by a sequence of convex loss functions in where you can see the data points in the stream are absorbed by the loss functions. So now the loss function is a function of the parameters of the predictive of the predictor of the prediction model, and the data points is appears as an index t in the loss. So a sequence of data points given a certain loss is replaced by a sequence of loss functions, each one individually defined on a different data point. Okay, and then the current now the online learning protocol plays out as follows. The current model is tested on the next loss function in the stream, and the algorithm is charged as the corresponding loss. And now an update, so a new model is computed based on the current model and the feedback information, which is what the environment is letting us know about the current data point and the performance of the algorithm on the data point. Typically, the kind of feedback information is a first-order oracle, which provides the gradient of the loss function on the current model. Okay, so this will be typically what a online learning algorithm will receive as a feedback information from the environment. Okay, so now how do we go about measuring performance when we are not assuming a statistical source for our data? So we are going to replace the notion of statistical risk, which is the way we measure performance in statistical learning, with the notion of sequential risk, which is just the sum of the losses incurred by the sequence of models generated by the online algorithm over the sequence of convex losses that are fed to the online algorithm. And the notion of variance error, which is the difference between the statistical risk of some predictor and the statistical risk of the best model in the class, is now replaced by the notion of regret, which is the difference between the statistical risk, the sequential risk, sorry, of the sequence of model generated by the online algorithm, and the sequential risk of the best model in the class V of models from which the online algorithm is picking the sequence of models WT. Okay, so you can see there is a pretty close similarity between the variance in statistical learning and regret in online learning. However, regret is measured without any statistical assumption. It's just a sequence of a sum of losses compared to the sum of losses with respect to some fixed best model in the class. All right, so the main problem now that we are facing is similar to what we ask for the variance error. We would like the variance error in statistical learning to vanish as the training set size grows. In this case, we are interested in ensuring that the average regret will vanish as a function of the length of the stream that we are observing. Okay, and we want to achieve this result irrespective of the specific sequence of convex losses that are fed to the algorithm. All right, so now we all know that there are some workhorse algorithms for instance, in statistical learning. Empirical risk minimization is like an algorithmic template that is widely used and is very useful. And it just says, okay, I have a class of predictors and I want to predict using the predictor from the class that is best performing on the training set. This is a very simple and effective principle. It can be, strengthened using regularization and so on. In online learning, this is replaced by sequential risk minimization. So again, we have this parametric model class V, and we're interested in the model W that minimizes the sequential loss over the first T elements over the first T losses in our stream. Okay. Unfortunately, since we are missing statistics here, it turns out that sequential risk minimization is very brittle. And indeed, in online learning, this algorithm, this sort of a principle, can be fooled very easily when the sequence of losses lack curvature. And this is, if you like, the problem here is that the algorithm is unstable. And we all know that stability implies statistical learnability, implies overfitting control in statistical learning. And in a similar way, we can define a notion of stability in online learning that helps to control regret, in the same way that the stability helps control the variance error of statistical learning. Okay, so the usual cure here to avoid this instability is something we all know from statistical learning. So we add a regularization term to our sequential risk minimization functional, and this regularizer will provide the curvature that helps make the algorithm stable. So in practice, we're going to add a term to the sum of the losses, which is a strongly convex regularizer, which is defined over the same model space as the loss functions. Okay, so the model space V. All right, so this algorithm is called follow the regularized leader, which sounds like a little strange name, but this is one of the names that has been somehow popularized in the online learning literature. And in order to be able to compute in a convenient way these the models produced by this algorithm, we are going to replace the loss functions with their loss gradients. Okay, remember that we receive as a feedback from the environment the gradient of the current model on the current loss. So this is available information that can be used by the online learner. And we use this information to linearize losses. Since we are assuming the losses are convex anyway, this linearization is not affecting the notion of regret. In other words, if we bound the regret in terms of linearized losses, we are going to bound the regret in terms of the original losses just because of convexity. All right, so we arrive now at this specific form that is a convex minimization problem constrained over our model class. And right, so let's call the sum of the loss gradients, which we've seen so far in the stream, using this theta t plus 1. And it turns out that if we forget for a moment that we are solving this minimization problem over the model class V, but we are assume that we are actually solving it over the entire space R to the D, then it turns out that the problem is very easy to solve. The solution, the WT plus 1, is provided by the convex conjugate function, more in particular by the gradient of the convex conjugate function of the regularizer evaluated at the sum of the gradients of the past losses. So this is information that is very easy maintained by the online algorithm. The online algorithm will observe these gradients. We will keep the sum of the gradients. This is a very cheap information to maintain. It's a d-dimensional vector. And then every time it needs to make a prediction, the algorithm will compute the gradient of the convex conjugate function of the regularizer. For most regularizer functions, this is a pretty easy computation to perform. So now we are left with the problem of actually taking into account the fact that we need to solve a constrained optimization problem, but this can be actually taken into account by doing some form of projection, and so that the final algorithm, the final form of the follow the regularized leader algorithm has the following three simple steps. We have a gradient update through which we maintain the sum of the gradients into this variable theta. We have something which is called the mirror mapping, which computes the predictor, the new model, the updated model in the unconstrained form. And then we have a projection based on a notion of divergence, which is called the Bregman divergence induced by the regularization function. So in other words, every regularizer will induce a geometry over the model space, and the projection of the after the mirror mapping in order to bring back our model into the model space will be performed according to this Bregman divergence, which is the projection, again, according to the geometry induced by the regularized function. So this is a pretty general framework in that it can accommodate different geometries. We can work in this framework with Euclidean geometry, or we can work with the simplex, the geometry of the simplex, and therefore with the entropy instead of Euclidean distance, okay? Or if you like, entropic regularization instead of Euclidean regularization. And we just use the same kind of analysis irrespective of the specific regularizer. So at the end of the day, if we do the analysis, the regret bound of the for follow the regularized leader takes the following form. So it will scale like a square root of time, which means that if we look at the average regret is vanishing at rate 1 over square root of t. And the scaling of this regret will depend on the Lipschitz constant of the loss, so which is a natural parameter measuring, let's say, which is related to this, the norm of the gradients of the loss, and the diameter of the model space measured according to the regularized function psi. So this is this d squared term here. Okay, so these are the natural scaling parameters for our regret. And this bound is not improvable in general. In particular, it's not improvable, not even is tight up to constants for the Euclidean space. But we can have more specialized bounds for other geometries, for instance, for the geometry of the simplex. Okay, let me now move to the second part of this talk, which concerns the Bandits, which is a partial feedback variant of online learning. So let me start by defining the Bandit model, which is again a model of online sequential decision making, but in the presence of partial feedback information. So we don't have access to the full gradient as before, but we have only access to a single coordinate of the gradient vector. Okay, so in in general, a bandit problem in this non-stochastic setting is a problem in which the decision maker has k actions, and there is an unknown deterministic assignment of losses to actions at every time step. And in each round, T, the decision maker will pick an action, possibly using randomization, will incur the corresponding loss, and will observe some feedback, which in the case of the bandit is just the value of the loss of the action picked by the decision maker. In other words, the losses associated to actions that are not chosen at that round by the algorithm will remain forever unknown. Okay, now we will relate this problem to the online convex optimization framework in a moment, but let me just mention first the fact that bandits are being used in a wide range of applications these days, including recommender systems, online advertising, auctions for advertisements on web, dynamic content optimization, and also clinical trials. Okay, so in this bandit model, we measure regret in a similar way to what we used for the more general online convex optimization framework. So we look at the expected cumulative loss of the decision maker based on the sequence of actions that were picked at each time step, I sub 1, I sub 2, and so on. And here the randomization is just with respect to the player's internal randomization because there's no randomness in the environment. And we compete against the best model in the class, which in this case is just the cumulative loss of the best action among the k actions that are available to the algorithm. All right. And so in order to solve this problem, we can just take our online convex optimization algorithm, follow the regularized leader, apply an entropic regularizer, because we can view randomized predictions, in other words, picking an action at random from the set of action as choosing a point in the simplex. So the decision space, which is a distribution of actions, corresponds to a point in the simplex. Therefore, our decision space is a simplex, and we can just plug in our machinery for online learning in the simplex. In particular, we will use entropic regularization in order to match the geometry of the simplex. The only twist is that we don't have access to the entire gradient, but we only observe a component of the gradient, which, because we are actually using linear losses here, corresponds to observing just the loss of the action that we picked. Okay, so observing the loss of the action that we picked in the bandit game corresponds to observing one component of the gradient in the online convex optimization framework. So what we needed to come up with in order to compensate for this lack of observation is to estimate the missing components of the gradient. So in other words, we will have estimates for the components for the losses of the actions that we didn't pick at every time step. All right, so there are clever ways to compute these estimates, and the key property of these estimates in the analysis of regret is their variance. And in particular, it turns out that one can upper bound the regret in the bandit case just by using the analysis of the follow the regularized leader and including a control over the variance of our loss estimates. Because unlike the online convex optimization framework, here we have uncertainty of losses, because we are not observing losses of all of the actions at every time step. So in the case of the bandits, the variance of these loss estimates is controlled by the number k, which is the number of the actions over which we are playing this game. And you see that the regatta is now bounded by these two terms that are traded off by eta, which is the learning rate of our online learning algorithm. And by tuning this learning rate eta, we arrive at a bound which is has a similar dependence on the square root of t on the time horizon, as we saw in the case of follow the regularized leader. And then it has an additional dependence k log k, where k is the dimensionality of the problem. In other words, is the number of actions that we are playing over. Okay? And by using a slightly more refined regularization, which is a Tsallis entropy instead of entropy or Shannon entropy, we can shave off the lnk term under the square root and get to a bound which is tied up to constant, which is just the square root of tk. Okay, very good. So now we want to see whether this machinery, this bandit machinery, can be applied to a specific context in which we will have losses and feedback that are dictated by some practical problem. In particular, we are looking at regatta minimization in online markets. These are markets where that are, in which trading is totally algorithmical. So there are high volume of trades where buyers and sellers are just algorithms. So decisions here are prices, and in order to abstract for any kind of granularity of these prices, we will just assume that these algorithms are free to choose any real number in the unit interval. So we will assume that these prices are normalized. And the idea is that we want to maximize the revenue, either sell or the seller, or minimize the expenses of the buyer in a sequence of trades. And this will be equivalent to minimizing regret with respect to the revenue of the best fixed price. Okay, so now we will look at we will compare against the best fixed price against a sequence of trades that are generated by some unspecified process. And again, we will use the power of online learning, which allows us to avoid any statistical assumption on the generation of these trading sequences. All right, so the main theme here is really to exploit the feedback structure provided by the market in order to control the variance of these revenue estimates. So as you see in the Bandit case, the key to the analysis is the control of the variance of the estimates, and we will and the variance of and this variance can be controlled through a clever exploitation of the feedback information. So in case of the markets, the feedback is actually different from one problem to the other, and can be in some cases easier than the Bandit feedback, and in some other cases harder than the Bandit feedback. And we will have to adjust our estimates in order to use up all the information provided by the feedback, so that we will be able to learn at the highest possible rate, and therefore to accumulate revenue at the best possible rate. So there is an history of applications that we're going to briefly review in the last minutes of this talk, and to different market problems. So let me start from a simple problem, which is posted price auctions. So in this case, there is a sequence of buyers that will arrive to buy some item and from, let's say, a platform. And each buyer will have some private valuation for the item being sold. And we always assume that this valuation is completely adversarial. So there are no statistical assumptions, and it belongs to some fixed and known interval like 0, 1. The seller, which is our player algorithm, will set the price. And if the price is smaller than, sorry, is higher, right, sorry, there is a wrong sign here. So if the valuation of the buyer is bigger than the price, then the item is sold. So it's not smaller than equal, but bigger than equal. And the only feedback that is provided is yes to the seller is yes if the item is sold and no otherwise. Okay, so the revenue function will be this time is correct, will be P, which is the price at which we sell, and the indicator function that the item is sold, which means that the valuation is bigger than the price. So the revenue function, you see the plot on the right-hand side. And the idea here is that the valuation of the buyer remains completely unknown. And then the regret, we can formulate it as now is going to be the revenue of the best price over a sequence of sales, and the actual seller's revenue achieved by an algorithm that is choosing a sequence of prices using our online learning framework. Okay, so here P star is the price maximizing the revenue of is the best fixed price over this sequence of sales. Okay, so the trick here, so there are two observations here. First of all, we can observe that there is a form of Lipschitzness, which we can call one-sided Lipschitzness of the revenue function as a function of prices. So the revenue function is not growing any faster than the straight line with coefficient, angular coefficient 1, which this allows us to discretize prices. So now we can put prices over a grid, and now we can decompose the regret over the grid plus some approximation error. Okay, so there's going to be a bandit error, which is the regret over the grid of prices, and the approximation error is that what we pay because we discretize the prices. And the one-sided Lipschitzness property allows us to control the approximation error. And then we can just run over the grid, finite grid of prices, we can run our online bandit algorithm, in which the number of actions is the number of grid points. And then we can just plug the bandit bound, which we saw for our XP3 algorithm. And the final regret will be the sum of the approximation error and the bandit error. And by tuning the grid size, we arrive at the bound, which will be this time slightly worse than the bandit bound, because we are playing on a continuous set of prices instead of the discrete set, and we will scale, the regret will scale with t to the 2/3. And this is, again, tight up to logarithmic factors. So this was kind of easy, no? The key trick is that we have some regularity in the revenue, so we can discretize prices and just plug in the bandit. So now, and then we get something that is slightly worse than the bandit rate, which was a square root of t, because we had to discretize. So we paid the discretization price. All right, let's see something different now. Let's see second price auctions with reserve price. So now the idea is that we do a second price auction in order to sell things, and we are always on the seller side. So what we choose here is the reserve price. And after we chose this reserve price, we see the bids are being submitted. And if the highest bid is below the reserve price, then the item is not sold. Otherwise, the winning bidder will pay the maximum between the second highest bid and the reserve price. This is the standard second price auctions. You can see the revenue of the seller as a function of the reserve price given the two highest bids, B1 and B2, in the plot on the right-hand side. Okay, so in this case, we assume that the feedback provided to the seller is the revenue, which is just a red curve evaluated at the point played, at the reserve price played by the seller, and the winning bid. Okay, so the fact that we see these two pieces of information allows the seller to compute, to have more feedback information than the bandit information. In particular, the seller can compute the revenue of all reserve prices that are bigger than the reserve that it has played. In other words, it can estimate, it actually can compute the revenue of all prices he could have played that are bigger than the price that he actually played that round. So this is more than bandit information. We just don't observe the revenue of the point we played, but we observe the revenue of a number of other points. So we can exploit this richer feedback and in the following way. So we observe that the this revenue function is again one-sided Lipschitz. So we can discretize prices again. We can decompose the regret into a bandit error and an approximation error, and we can use the one-sided Lipschitz to bound the approximation error, and we can run XP3 over these prices, but this time we are going to change slightly the algorithm to exploit the additional information. So we will play the zero reserve price with some higher probability than what is prescribed by the bandit algorithm XP3, because this zero reserve price is called the revealing action. It will give us feedback information about all the remaining, about all the other reserve prices we could have played. Okay. So we have a better control on the variance of these estimates thanks to this additional feedback, and we can recover a rate that is much better than the previous rate, which was t to the 2/3, and now we almost back at the standard bandit rate of square root of t. We just pay an additional LNT factor. Okay, so I'm almost, actually I'm running out of time. So there are different applications, but I will go through them very quickly. So there's other variants of posted price auctions in which we want to control the social welfare, which means that the revenue of the seller and the money that the buyer saved by paying less than the actual evaluation he had for the object. And in this case, we can again exploit the feedback structure to carefully design estimates that allow us to control sorry, I'm going a little bit fast here. And here we get the control of final regret by controlling the variance of t to the 2/3, which is again optimal. And there are harder scenarios like the bilateral trading scenario, in which we don't even observe our own revenue. And these are really harder cases in which the adversarial environment prevents us from obtaining a sublinear regret. So we can prove a lower bound that in this case, like in the bilateral trading case, if we have a fully adversarial setting, then there is no way we can get a sublinear regret. So in other words, we cannot learn the best price that we can offer to buyer and seller in this framework. So in these cases, we can resort to intermediate models. In particular, we look at the case of smoothed adversaries. So this is a model in which the adversary has a limited control over the over the sequence of trades that is proposing to the algorithm. In particular, in the case of bilateral trading, the adversary is computing the price of the seller and the price of the buyer. So the valuation for the seller and valuation for the buyer. Okay, and these valuations, in all previous cases, these valuations were completely under control of the adversary. However, it turns out that in order to allow, when in these harder settings where the revenue is not observable, in order to allow the obtaining a sublinear regret, and so in order to learn something, we take away a little bit of control from the adversary, so the adversary can control the valuation of seller and buyer up to a certain stochasticity, which has to have a given Lipschitz constant. So in other words, the adversary can choose evaluations that have to be multiplicative close to the uniform distribution. Okay, so it's a nice interpolation between a stochastic adversary and a fully deterministic adversary. Okay, in this case, we can get meaningful rates and obtain a control on the regret, which will be a function again of time and also a function of the Lipschitz constant of the adversary that controls how smooth is this adversary with respect to the uniform distribution, which will be the smoothest case. Okay, I would like to stop here because I ran out of time. And yeah, so to conclude, online learning is providing a nice angle through which we can study the analysis. We can analyze and study digital markets. And this bandit analysis allows us to control the quality, to capture how the quality and the quantity of feedback affects the learning rates. And we are able to capture the best possible rates at which the player can learn in these models. And finally, one of the most interesting developments of this thread of research is to look at cases in which all more than one. In this case, we would have like one player which is using regret minimization, and the other player is under control of the adversary. In general, we might have multiple players. And all of them might run regret minimization algorithms. This is closest to actual scenarios in which both, let's say, seller and buyer will use algorithms that are based on regret minimization. And this joint dynamics of regret minimization algorithms playing against each other is something pretty fascinating that is still not fully understood. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.
So I invite all the listeners, if they want to type their questions in the chat. In the meantime, if you want, I have a question. It's a question of somebody.
I'm hearing you crackling. There's a lot of crackling in the background. Your voice was perfectly clear before I talked. After my talk,
is it better now?
Now it's fine. Now it's good. Now it's fine. Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, my Mac switched the mic and the. No, it's a question related to your final scenarios, and I mean, you presented scenarios that are kind of bilateral trading, but if we think of scenarios that go into a multi-actor also for the sellers, for instance, I don't know, 2 competing sellers and 100 buyers, which is more similar to reality. I don't know. I have Amazon and somebody else selling the same thing, and the buyers. Scenarios like that. Would these kind of techniques, or do they cover already scenarios like that? Would they cover scenarios like that?
They don't. I mean, these techniques take an easy shortcut in the sense that they assume, okay, I am lumping up all the other players in a single entity, which is this adversarial entity, and then I am, prepared against whatever they can do. However, as I said, in reality, we will have players that, most players, we will use these algorithms, all of them. So now the scenario is not an adversarial scenario anymore, but even more, what people are actually looking at is ways through which one can exploit the knowledge that the other players are regret minimizers. So if the other players are regret minimizers, and I know this information, I can try to steer their behavior towards directions that will be beneficial for me, for instance. So this is a very interesting theme that is being studied. And the other, there is another thread of research which is also extremely interesting that has been looked at in the past years. Is like, look, if both of us are playing regret minimization, now I am not experiencing a worst case, an adversarial sequence. I'm experiencing a sequence which is actually kind of regular, because these algorithms are stable. Therefore, they won't change their decisions wildly one step from the other. So now this thing can be exploited in the analysis to show that if both players play a regret minimization algorithm, they will converge much faster than the rates that I expect if I am facing an unknown adversary. Okay, so I will converge exponentially faster, in other words, and with respect to the rate 1 over square root of t, which is guaranteed against arbitrary adversaries. So yeah, this is something that is the fact that in practice everybody is using the same kind of algorithms is providing lots of information that can be looked at different ways. Is this helping? Can I exploit it? Can I program my agent, which does regret minimization, in order to exploit the fact that the other agents will be also using regret minimization?
Thank you. Are there other? Giuseppe?
I have a follow-up question. So this has a lot to do with what is called rationality, no? Rationality in multiplayer games. So when you assume rationality by the other peers, okay, you also become more fragile, however, less resilient, because now you are somehow not defending yourself against all possible scenarios, but only those scenarios that are rational. So is this concept studied, considered? So the trade-off between being able to do more, but also become more fragile, more dependent on this assumption.
So my interpretation of your question is, is there a way of being able to exploit with a faster rate or with some increased revenue the fact that my opponent is doing regret minimization, but at the same time to fall back on the standard guarantee if my opponent is actually doing something completely different? Okay. And this is definitely an interesting question, and I think this can be guaranteed, but not in all generality. So in certain scenarios this can be guaranteed, but not in all scenarios. I think it's a very interesting question in general. So yeah, So in some cases, it's sort of a variant of this best of both worlds kind of analysis, in which if the world is benign, then you want to win big, but you want to be agnostic. So if the world is actually adversarial, you don't want to lose a lot. And yeah, I haven't seen. Yeah, this is a no. I think it is. This is question is not answered in full generality at all. So it's interesting.
Okay.
Gianluigi, yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, Nicolò, thank you very much for your nice talk. I have a couple of questions from the perspective of the students that will have a look later at your video. So the first one is concerning experimentation, so the experimental part of this kind of studies, work, and area. So is there any accepted benchmark, and is there any place, environment where one can find implementation of the basic algorithms that you have discussed?
Yeah. There is definitely several packages that are offered. I know at least a couple of them. One is curated by John Langford, another one by Francesco Rabona, but I'm sure there are more out there. So yes, this is possible. And in terms of benchmarks, this is trickier. Yeah, and because so typically what people do in online learning is that obviously you cannot generate your data random, otherwise you are define the purpose of having an online learning algorithm, which is somehow robust against adversarial manipulations. So what you do, you create data that are modeled using lower bounds. So lower bounds are designed in a tricky way in order to prove that actually these rates are achieved in certain cases. And you can use these lower bounds to generate data that are particularly nasty, so that you can see differences in the behavior. However, again, the previous questions also offer a natural setting in which you have different online algorithms working one against each other. It's like in a buyer-seller scenario for auctions, for instance, or in an auction in which the two buyers will run online algorithms, and therefore they will outbid each other in a certain way. This is a very interesting experiment that is now Noam Nizan is working on these things. I've seen a few talks by him as his PhD student, in which basically it turns out that for instance, if you run a second price auction or a first price auction where bidders run Regatta minimization algorithms like those that I was talking about, you will see behaviors that are not actually consistent with what is known for the one-shot game. So if you play, if you play a second price auction one shot, you know that there is a famous theorem that tells you that you should bid your valuation. There's no incentive of bidding something smaller than your valuation. Whereas in first price auction, there is an incentive of bidding, of shading your bid. So I think it's worth 100, but since I'm paying 100, I want to save money, so I'm bidding 80. So, but if you run this in a sequence using Regatta minimization algorithm, you will see behaviors that are not consistent with these analyses. So this is and so you can prove formally why this is the case, under which conditions the repeated equilibria will deviate from the equilibria of the single game. So this is a very nice experimental work that is very easy to do, and it's actually very deep. It can give you amazing insights on the behavior of these algorithms. So on these learning dynamics. Okay. So the learning dynamics is tricky, and especially when you have several players. And we are now in the stage of understanding the property of the learning dynamics based on the property of the one-stage game.
Okay, thank you. Just one curiosity: what do you think it's the next step in this area? So where, if you were a student, so which kind of problems would you focus now?
Yeah, so I think, of course, this is a very difficult question because there are many directions. One direction is certainly so there is a thread of research in which you want to somehow look at what happens when I change the amount of information that players have with respect to each other. For instance, in general, it's not even clear that the buyer will know. Typically, we don't know how much something is worth, right? So typically, maybe we buy something. Don't say I bought it on Wish and then I got this, but it's like this is like the example you see. You buy something, then okay, once you have it, you find out what actually it is worth. So and then right. So however, the buyer can get an idea of the valuation of something, for instance, by reading reviews. Okay. So now I can read the reviews and obtain an estimate of the value I give to the object I want to buy. Okay. Now, if I am a seller, now I might want to say, okay, maybe I will give the object away cheap at the beginning because I want people to provide reviews so that other people will have an easier way to estimate the value of the object if I think my object is worthy, of course. So now there is a sort of a nice interplay between the fact that, I'm a buyer, I miss information about the valuation, so I have a hard time in bidding or deciding whether I want to buy it at a certain price. And as a seller, I have an incentive to have this side information such as reviews to accumulate quickly so that buyers can actually trust their own valuations because they have good estimates and then come and buy it. So this is something that is very nice. I think is a very fascinating area in which you have incentives incentives from the seller side to provide information to the buyer in order for the buyer to buy more. And this is what we actually observe in practice. And I think this is a very fascinating direction. We are seeing a few papers in this direction, but it's really, a lot of it is still unexplored.
Thank you.
So, I think it's kind of time to close, unfortunately, because we want to stick to the hour format. I thank you, Niccolò Cesabianchi, also on behalf of the IPERIA, the Italian Association for Artificial Intelligence. As Gianluigi said at the beginning, this is the last spring seminar, but stay tuned because we are already thinking of the next series. So I don't know whether Gianluigi, you want to say something, but there will be other seminars and there will be other chances to listen to nice talks, important people, clever people presenting their research.
Yes, Chiara, I want to take the opportunity to thank you and Giuseppe for the great support in this organization of these seminars. I want to take the opportunity to thank the speakers of the spring series. So we had Joshua Benjo, Michela Milano, and now I kindly thank Niccolò Cesabianchi. And yes, we will start again with a new series of seminar in autumn. So there will be the summer stop, and then we will be back in autumn again with our invited speakers from all around Italy and abroad. So Niccolò, thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next series. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.